So now I'd like to welcome Tom Davey to talk about Close Encounters with David Nobbs and When Orwell Met Hemingway. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, and hello everybody. My first story really relates to a personal encounter that I had. I was on a train between Newcastle and London for a meeting with the work I was doing, and the carriage was very, very busy. And at York, this quite dishevelled man got on the train and sat next to me. And he very quickly opened a book, and out of nosiness, I looked at the back of the book and realised that the person on the back of the book was the person who I was sitting next to. And we spoke quite civilly and we introduced ourselves. And he introduced himself as David Nobbs. And David Nobbs, for those of a certain age, will remember that he wrote and scripted The Rise and Fall of Reginald Perrin, the sort of eponymous story of the man who succeeds and then fails, and I think succeeds again later. Anyway, David was just an absolute, utter gentleman through that 2 hours. I first of all asked him why he was sitting in second class, and I'd already told him my name, and he said, "Tom, BBC don't pay any more for first class, whoever we are." But then he just lit up the whole carriage with guffaws of laughter as he told me anecdote over anecdote of different people. And I'd like to share a couple of those with you. He was talking about the famous comedy actor from the 1960s and 1970s, a guy called Jimmy Edwards. Now, Jimmy Edwards, as you can see from the picture, looks like some sort of sergeant major, but a bit of a jolly chap as well as he was. And for those of you who remember things like the Terry Wogan show and the Parkinson show, Jimmy Edwards was a regular on those programs, and sat every time, whatever time of the afternoon or evening it was, with a glass of whiskey, and he would look a little bit tipsy and a little bit drunk and tell lots of anecdotes. Well, actually, what David Nobbs told me was that Jimmy Edwards never, ever drank when he was on television, never when it was live or anything else. Yes, he liked to tipple in the green room, and he loved his whiskey. But that whiskey that you'll see on the Terry Wogan show and the Parkinson show and everything else was apple juice. Obviously, with the Rise and Fall of Reginald Perrin, he was very keen to talk a little bit about Leonard Rossiter. Now, Leonard Rossiter, sadly, as some of you may know, died on a squash court. But he was also a big pal of Tommy Steele, the musician, who was also a very, very good squash player. And David Nobbs tells stories of Rossiter and Steele virtually killing themselves on the squash courts, literally hammer and tongs, but then shaking hands and going for a drink afterwards, and were total friends. But when they hit the courts, they were total enemies. The one that raised the most laughter with me, and I think everybody else was listening, because he then started to talk about the famous comedian Tommy Cooper to me. Now, we all know again, Tommy Cooper died on stage. Tommy Cooper was a very sociable man, and the story he told me was that after one of his shows, whatever it was, Sunday night at the London Palladium, let's say it was that, I can't remember, he decided that he would take his agent and all of the crew, the lighting crew, out for a drink in the West End. So they all sat down in this restaurant, and he said, "I'll go and get the drinks in." And he stopped and he said, "No, I won't get the drinks in. Does anybody want any food? I'll get the food in as well." And they said, "Oh yes, that's great, Mr. Cooper, thank you, great." So Tommy Cooper goes to the bar, orders the drinks, orders the meal, they all arrive, and then guess what happens? Tommy Cooper then gets the bill, and it's all itemized, and they've got to pay for them all. He was quite a mean old man, as well as a very good comedian and a very good magician. All I'd like to say now about David Nobbs is that, apart from the fact that I did buy his book, by the way, I've got to tell you that, was that he was an absolute, utter gentleman, an honest man, a very friendly man. He took an interest in me and what my profession was. He probably irritated the hell out of a lot of the people who were trying to do work, but it was the most pleasurable meeting of a celebrity I've ever had. Thank you. The next story I want to relate is about a book I read, oh God, it must be 10, 15 years ago now. Many of you will be familiar with the historian and writer Anthony Beaver, but he actually wrote one of his first books, Paris After the Liberation, with his wife, the wonderfully named Artemis Cooper. And it's a fantastic book of memories about what happened when Paris was liberated. And the story I'd like to relate is a story about Hemingway and George Orwell. Orwell and Hemingway, unknown to each other, were staying in the same hotel, the Scribe Hotel in the centre of Paris near l'Opéra. And Hemingway was in his room. He was just about to go out the next day on the Ardennes offensive with the American troops. And he was all packed, and there was a knock on the door. And the story goes that he's the knock on the hotel door. This man appears and introduces himself as Eric Blair and says, "I'd like to meet you, Mr. Hemingway." Hemingway doesn't recognize Eric Blair, and in no uncertain terms and with many expletives, sends him packing as well, and tells him to go somewhere else. At that point, Eric Blair says, "No, actually, Eric Blair, I'm Eric Blair, I'm George Orwell, the writer." And Hemingway says, "Why didn't you tell me so? Come in," he says. And allegedly he scrambles under the bed where all his suitcases are, half unpacks one of his suitcases and offloads a full bottle of whiskey, offers Orwell a glass of whiskey and says, "Would you like it with ice?" And then realizes that there's no ice in the restaurant and no ice in the hotel. Says, "No, you can't have it with ice, but you can have it neat or you can have it with water." Orwell accepts it. And a few hours later, after the full bottle's finished, Orwell leaves and Hemingway gets ready to join the Ardennes offensive. What would it have been like to have been in that room, listening to the stories of those two famous writers and their tales of the Spanish Civil War, of socialism, of hunting perhaps, and bullfighting, whatever we believe or dislike or find heinous about that, and about the interesting and wonderful lives that George Orwell, or was it Eric Blair, and Ernest Hemingway related to each other. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. That was really interesting. Shall we have some questions from the rest of the group?
Hi, Rosie.
Oh, hi. Really enjoyed that. Thank you. I'm a big fan of a later David Nobbs show. What's it called? I've forgotten. Oh, this is ridiculous. Sorry. It's the one with David Jason. A bit of a do, of course.
Oh, yes, that was fantastic.
Which is fabulous situational comedy, but it's about a really astute observation of people and the way they act. Did you get an impression of him as almost a sort of Jane Austen type when you were talking to him?
I think that's a really good question. And yes, I was a huge fan of that television series as well, more than the Rise and Fall of Reginald Perrin, because I think it just came more to life. I think I got the impression, Rosie, from David Nobbs that he was an astute observer character and an astute observer of the actor and the real person. I can't remember the name of the famous woman actress who was in the TV series you mentioned, but he talked quite honestly about her her mental health issues and her problems with food issues as well, and he was very honest while not disclosing anything that would be improper. He brought alive that those people were real people, and the characters that they portrayed, whoever they were fictitious, but were true to life as well. I think the other interesting thing that he shared was that he did national service, and it does come out in his book that he was in a homosexual relationship with another soldier, but he married later on in life, I think in his late 30s or early 40s as well. And he was quite willing, in a much more discreet and quiet way, to disclose that, and how his own personal sort of anxieties and issues and sexuality would come out in the characters of the people who he wrote and directed as well. I'm not sure if that's answered your question, Rosie.
That's actually really interesting. You always get interested in the people behind characters. And I love that idea that there's an element of reality about it.
Yeah, definitely was an element of reality within the fiction. And he seemed to be saying that he couldn't write those characters without personal experience of himself and of other people. And therefore that relationship with Jane Austen and others I think is very, very true, and a good description of what he was in his own contemporary way.
Great, thank you.